so much for being here, waiting till the final, the end of the day. We really appreciate it. But we have come to the students, who are really, in a way, I think, the core of the question here. We've talked throughout the day, and indeed last night at dinner, about the essential foundations of a thriving university. What does a university need in order to pursue truth? Jonathan Rauch, see you're still here, which is great, spoke of the constitution of knowledge, which includes norms such as open discourse and viewpoint diversity. And as an educational institution, of course, we are known for our research, but we do also teach undergraduates, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds. So it's not only our job to model these norms as faculty members, we have to try to instill them in the students in a way that might be among our most important missions. We need to foster these norms among the students themselves. So our panel today has students who are, I would say, very active in the trenches on all these matters. And our aim today is to give you a sense of how they and these norms are faring on our campus, and how they, and perhaps you, can help ensure that they flourish. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce each of them, and then ask them to, each one, tell you briefly about the extent to which they think open discourse and viewpoint diversity is alive and well on our campus. Then we'll have a conversation based on the things that they say, and then finally we will open it up to your questions. So without further ado, we will start with Mariam Abdelbarr, who is a junior majoring in brain and cognitive science, course 9, and management, course 15, who, in addition to her double major, spends a significant amount of time cultivating environments where civil discourse and constructive disagreement are welcomed. Mariam joined Concourse as a freshman and has remained involved as a TA for our chemistry class, CC 512, and for now, is this the second year, as a TA for my core humanities class, as well as serving as one of our debate fellows using the Braver Angel method, which was promoted very, very nicely early on. Mariam's also a Burchard Scholar and the UA Vice President, so you can ask her about governmental matters, governance, and a member of the basketball team. Next is Siddhu Pachipala, another junior studying political science and mathematical economics, also a Concourse student in his freshman year, and also continues to be deeply involved as a TA for numerous courses and as a debate fellow as well. In his other work, he conducts research on how generative AI can moderate conversations on controversial political topics to reduce partisan polarization, and he serves as an Army ROTC cadet. He's worked as a grassroots fundraising intern on the Harris Waltz campaign, and has been in the New York Times, Slate, and Newsweek, and CNN, writing guest essays. Next, we have Spencer Sindhusen, who is also a junior, double majoring also in political science and management. Since January 2024, he served as president of MIT Open Discourse Society, a student group functioning to host guest speakers, debates, and networking events with the aim of introducing the MIT community to a variety of viewpoints and promoting civil, productive interactions among the different viewpoints. And then finally, last but not least, we have Aniruddha Nrusimha. Ani is a PhD student in the EECS department at MIT. His interests are primarily in ML systems and ML policy. The goal of his research is to give the public greater control of the algorithms and models they interact with through better small-scale systems and policy-enshrined rights and protections. And in addition to being a voracious reader of books and blogs, Ani is active in dialogues on campus, including the Third Space Lunch, where we first met. So let me start with Mariam and just ask you to talk a little bit about climate, MIT.
Okay, can everyone hear me? All right, nice to see you guys. I'll sort of go through what my thoughts were when I first heard this prompt, but I'm happy to talk further about anything else later, as well as the UA, although this statement itself isn't directly associated with the UA. So our First Amendment rights are integral to our democracy. I think we all probably agree on that point. However, the nuances, what counts as protected speech versus a true threat or defamation, are more contested. From my perspective, the broader climate in our country shows an atmosphere where free speech is being manipulated and restricted in dangerous ways. This threat has had sweeping ramifications across political parties, and recent events make clear how urgent addressing this issue is. That national trend makes it all the more important for MIT to examine its own climate. MIT is filled with brilliant minds solving some of the world's most complex technical challenges. But we have untapped potential to engage just as fully with humanistic questions. Yes, we come here for a world-class education, but we also owe it to society to confront its most pressing issues. If a university with some of the smartest people on earth can't model constructive dialogue, then who can? One change we need on campus is a clear understanding of the quote-unquote line that free speech cannot cross. Who are the populations that should be protected from real threats? What does it mean to draw that line without shutting down uncomfortable but necessary conversations? Another change is fostering a stronger sense of ownership, recognizing that beyond problem sets and research, we are also citizens of a broader community and world. That's why it is hard to give a direct answer to what the climate of free speech is like at MIT, because I would venture to say that the majority of students are not very invested in probing the bounds extensively. There have been some notable instances where these boundaries have been tested, clear cases of inappropriate speech maybe, like in the David Spicer incidents, more contentious ones like the encampments and counter-protests, and debates over institutional choices like last year's commencement speaker. These examples show why the bounds of free speech at MIT should not be left vague. They should be collaboratively shaped by an engaged student body committed to diversity of perspective and constructive discourse, or at least realistically to model what it might mean to embody the idea that authority is to be controlled by public opinion, not public opinion by authority. In my own work, I've seen how valuable this can be. As a TA for Professor Rabieh's class, I've watched students thrive when they can speak openly without fear of repercussions. As a debate fellow, I've seen how students grow by challenging themselves to absorb new perspectives and argue both sides of an issue. And as a student leader, I've worked to bring these concerns to the administration to strengthen dialogue between students and adult leadership. The climate at MIT is still being defined, but it can also be shaped. I believe that with clear boundaries, greater student ownership, and a commitment to dialogue, MIT can set an example for how free speech should function in a community of scholars, and then maybe how we can start to operate as a broader society. And I will continue to use my roles here to help push that change forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Siddhu.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh, I think that's pretty loud. So when I was thinking about this question on how to think about what the climate's like here at MIT, and specifically with the students, I think of MIT students as very practical people, very busy people, people that, for a large part, don't have time to be passionately ideological. And so I think we are more protected from the worst excesses of the kind of orthodoxy we see at other universities. We're too busy taking classes to be thinking much about other things. But I think generally still, there is this sense among students that political questions are basically settled, and there's nothing really to talk about anymore. The major alternatives to the dominant positions on campus are offensive or backward or just clearly wrong. And so I think this gives rise to another position, which is that engaging with those perspectives would do harm. You're giving someone a platform that allows them to voice their views, and then that lets those incorrect views gain purchase, and that then effectuates harm. It elevates or makes legitimate a perspective as within the realm of polite or acceptable opinion. That's something capable of being debated. It's a somewhat sensible position if you take your perspectives seriously and really believe it to be true. If you really believe that the questions of immigration or gender relations or race relations or criminal justice or gun control or healthcare are just basic and easy to answer, then it wouldn't make sense, it seems, to want to have them be up for debate. And it makes sense why this is the reaction, because to have those very fundamental positions be challenged or attacked, it feels like you yourself are being challenged or attacked, especially when our political affiliations are more central to our identities than our other affiliations, our religious ones, our civic ones. And so it's easy to get away with not talking to other people or not wanting things to be talked about when most people on campus basically agree with you. I think there's two good responses to this that the university and administrators and humanities educators and alumni can think through. And the first is that that's just not a really good strategy if you want your political ideas to win, even just practically. We've seen how the last decade has played out. That hasn't helped positions on the liberal left win. The second response is more out of principle. And I think back to what we read in Professor Rabieh's class in the spring, Madison and Federalist 10, which is that if people have the freedom to form their own opinions, and as long as our reason is fallible, then we're gonna diverge on our answers to the most important questions to us. The questions of the good life, how should we live? The questions of the just society, how should we live together? And so the first fact of our politics then is our differences. And I think it's important for students to understand that plurality as the first fact of our politics means that we're gonna have to think in certain ways, right? It means that if we were to make decisions amidst plurality, we basically have two options. Either we can impose our partial positions on everyone else through force or through violence on some unconsenting others, or we can use speech. We can face those that disagree with us and persuade or be persuaded. It's either force or it's argument. And I don't think the former should appeal to us. And I think it's by making that clear, the alternatives that are on the table. It's either force and violence or it's argument through reasoned speech that makes students see this more clearly. And giving the concept of why we even have these systems in the first place, right? The ideas that constitute the basis of our liberal society were conceived at a time of enormous violence and bloodshed in Europe over differences in opinion. And I think if we see that more clearly, then we're less willing to think this way. So the sense, I think, that you shouldn't have to deal with your political opponents, that it'd kind of be better if they went away, it's a dangerous one. And I think part of our response has to be bringing out the implications of what that is. And that if we don't put reasoned speech at the center of our political practice, there's a straight through line between that and the kind of violence we see play out. So what does that demand from us at MIT? I think it means a recommitment to an education for good citizenship. And if you think about our system of government and what it asks of us, it compels us to form big and durable majorities over multiple elections to get anything done. And I think our sense that our institutions aren't delivering or they aren't getting anything done stems from, in part, our inability to even just deal with each other, to accommodate other people, to compromise, to believe that the other side might actually have a point, might actually want the best for our country, and that they are good and decent people too. And those things aren't natural to us. We have to practice them. And so it is in humanities classes that put reasoned argument and disagreement over tough questions at the center. And I think Concourse and Professor Rabieh's class does this especially well because, you know, it's in your freshman fall and you come in with all these great big ideas, and I think Professor Rabieh and Concourse have this really clear vision about the kind of political practice and speech that we should honor and recognize at the university, which is reasoned speech, right? Not just words that express our feelings or vibes, but justify and defend and counter-argue. And so it's often the case in Professor Rabieh's class that we are thrown back on ourselves to explain a position that we hold dearly and realize we don't actually have a very good reason for holding it. And we don't really know as much as we think we did. We used to joke my freshman year that you would always hear the sentence, "I want to push back on that," from Professor Rabieh in class. And so I think it's through an education like that, in Concourse or through a civil discourse event, that you realize the incompleteness of your own understanding, your fallibility, that individually we don't actually have good access to the whole of political truth. And it's that disposition about the limits of your own knowledge that then nudges you toward more conversations. And I think it's in the classroom and at MIT where instructors can bring that disposition about.
Thank you. Spencer.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to see familiar faces, but also new ones. I'd like to start by saying we've got good news and bad news. So good news, by the way, is my microphone working? Or?
Just tap it.
Oh, there we go.
Can you hear?
Can everybody hear me?
Can you hear Spencer?
Just a little backward in terms of technology.
Good
but
thing you go to MIT.
Exactly. Anyways, we got good news and bad news. So the good news, I've been working with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions of FIRE, and we discovered that our ranking this past year has improved quite significantly for MIT's. And I have two theses for why that is. So one is that we have made organizational improvements on our own. We've become better in terms of free speech and campus expression. And second one, because rankings are relative, it may be that our peers, across the river, Harvard, Yale, a lot of these places, Brown, Columbia, may have done worse in terms of free speech, and we've seen some of those qualitatively through some of the stories and some of the, the national news in the past year. But my intuition is that it's actually a mix of both, because from my experience, I've been the president of the MIT Open Discourse Society. We've hosted a series of events with speakers, ranging from Jay Bhattacharya, the now director of the NIH, to Dennis Prager last year. And we found that a lot of students showed up. They expressed interest in some of these topics and an interest in engaging in a productive civil discussion with Des Prager, with all the speakers who came. They asked tough questions that Professor Rabieh and I were just talking about this before. And they asked tough questions, but they were also respectful. They were genuinely engaged and interested in learning and exchanging ideas. And so that speaks to the quality and the intellectual capacity, but also the willingness of MIT students to engage in some of these productive dialogue. But the bad news part is that we still got more way to go. The wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, tragically, two weeks ago, we saw some vitriolic responses, or some nasty responses to the assassinations. That people actually openly celebrated that incident on public, domains, public forums. MIT has something called dorm spam, basically a system of emails sent to the entire campus. And even though it's a small minority, it's the kind of thing that G.K. Chesterton would have described as the thought that stops thought, and that's the kind of thought that needs to be stopped, because a lot of conservatives, and I myself speak as a Ciceronian conservative on MIT's campus. I know a lot of people who feel that this kind of celebration is quite dangerous or quite threatening, because there are people who would dance on our graves. But we can also see that this is a national trend. It's not just an MIT thing, and I think this is a kind of cultural faucet that needs to be addressed through not just policy, but also through communities. There's a lot of there's place for more virtue, more moral, or more respectful dialogue in terms of some of these topics. And this brings me to the topic of what education is for. The Greeks actually had an idea called the paideia. So basically, education is not just to instill technical knowledge to make people smarter. At MIT, we do that all the time. We can go out, build amazing things, and do a lot of amazing research, amazing inventions. But education is also to impart virtue, to impart culture, a lot of cultural heritage, to enable people to engage in society, in civic society as a productive member, and to advance the cause of humanity, to advance social good. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to be considered going forward. I know MIT's been doing quite spectacularly with Professor Rabieh's Concourse Program. I mean, I would have loved the privilege of being in that program my freshman year. Unfortunately, I chose the some molecular biology seminar instead of Concourse, so forgive me for that. But I'd love to see this kind of thing expanded throughout MIT because MIT has graduation requirements, JRs, mostly scientific stuff, but also some of the communication intensive and humanities subjects. But at the same time, students still have the liberty to pick and choose what classes they take, and sometimes the humanities requirements do not necessarily include classes that would involve this kind of dialogue. Sometimes some of the humanities classes in the political science department are more lecture based and less about exchanging ideas. So I feel like expanding this culture, expanding this program, or having something similar applied to the entire institute would be a productive step for campus discourse. And also the other aspect of the bad news side that I spoke to is that, and I mean, in my personal experience, a lot of professors that I've interacted with have been, they are willing to speak freely about their sort of political beliefs when it comes from the left wing of the political spectrum, whereas some of the more conservative, some of the more right-wing opinions need to be said in confidence. And I think that this reflects a national culture where a lot of people are still in fear of repercussion, not just from the Charlie Kirk incident, but also just when we talk about gender relations, when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about climate and all of that, sometimes people still feel like they'd be ostracized, they'd be liable, they'd be condemned, or otherwise harassed. They expressed opinions that are not in the predominant opinion. So we definitely have a way to go on that. And I'd like to conclude my sort of speech on this point. So in Ephesians 4:15, our duty is to speak with charity, speak truth in charity, and that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of obligation that I'd love to see all MIT students rise to. We can all express our opinions, we can all say what we believe in, but charity is also a central part of expression, and I think that's something that would lead toward a more civil, more respectful, and more free-flowing marketplace of ideas.
Thank you. Ani.
Hi. Okay, is this working? Great. Hi, everyone. I am a grad student, and I think the probably most relevant pieces I have to discuss here are two. One is, I think the first thing I want to discuss is I think there's like kind of a lack of demand for free speech and discussion at MIT. What do I mean by lack of demand? I think there's like a meaningful sense. So I did my undergrad at Berkeley. And one thing, you're part of an undergrad when you are at a place like Berkeley, there's a lot of discussion about issues, a lot of discussion about what people feel about things in terms of like what is the right way to. So I work in AI, that's my research. I work on making models faster. I work on trying to build like policy prescriptions that balance most of what I do is making them faster, but I also try to make them safe, and that's a separate thing. And I think it's quite normal to have discussions in an environment like that about what people are doing. Do we like what people are doing? Are we worried about the repercussions? I work on LLMs. There's a lot of worries about propaganda, misinformation. There's worries about the bias of these models from both sides of the aisle. And I think at Berkeley, there was like it was definitely skewed in one direction, but at least there was a a vibrant discourse on how people felt about all this. What concerns me about MIT, and I'm a grad student, so this is part of the bias, but talking to a lot of undergrads, talking to a lot of people, is that people really just want to put their head down and get work done. And I think that's fine, but I think to have a area where you have robust free speech, it's not enough to just have an avenue where people are comfortable saying what they believe. You also want to have an area where you have space for these conversations. And my worry is part of the reason that among grad students, we don't have time to think about free speech concerns, these sorts of things, because there's so much of an institutional focus. I think the culture is so focused around trying to make sure that you can get your degree and get out as stably and hopefully quickly as possible. And I think that that focus is great. I myself am definitely occasionally a part of this. But it has the situations. I'm a refs at MIT. Basically, I'm a peer counselor where, as a peer counselor, I've had to deal with people who have been unable to have discussions, who have very troubled views about their work, but felt that there was no kind of space to have those discussions because there's no interest. And so I encourage you, as you're thinking about okay, how do we make this a place where we can have these conversations? I think that one issue right now is that there's a pretty pervasive notion that, at least on MIT's campus, what feels different from the time I've spent on other campuses is how much of a focus there is on get the work done and then don't worry as much about the rest. The second thing I wanted to discuss, or in this short blurb at the beginning, is I think that as a grad student, for better and worse, mostly for the better, you're kind of focused on the work you're doing. But there's been a lot of worry recently, and I've been talking to a lot of students who are worried about their speech on various platforms being a concern for either deportation or restriction of returning back to the country. Regardless of what your feelings are on the issue, I think that, I'm sure people are aware here, but I've also had students who feel concerns about I don't want to give my speech on campus because of wanting to put either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli views and worried about how that might go through. I do want to highlight that I think one thing that has changed in the kind of peer counseling I've done over the past year is that immigration concerns, especially around visas, are much more salient for reasons people are worried might want to restrict speech and these sorts of things. So I encourage people to, as kind of the world's moving quickly. I feel that strongly when I'm doing my research in AI. There's new baselines every day, new work to be looked at. I think it's important to not just fight yesterday's war, but also to focus on current problems. I'm very worried right now about how visa concerns are affecting people's, not just their concerns about speech, but also there's plenty of tech companies who are doing actions that some people in our community have issue with, whether that be kind of XAI's borderline, probably is a word I should not use on in a conversation such as this, but or Facebook or Meta's directives that their AI bots are allowed to have romantic conversations with children. There's all sorts of things people don't want to do, but feel pressure to due to visa issues. So I think that part of a free speech platform that I encourage you to think about is trying to make sure that to have robust defenses of free speech, we really need a more stable and calm regime for kind of immigration and visas. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's on the late side. If we don't want to try your patience, I have one question that I'm just curious if they would like to respond to, and then I think maybe after that, I'm just going to open it up to your questions. And I guess what I would like to to vindicate Siddhu, I'm going to push back a little bit and say that it does seem as though, I mean, you're right, MIT students work really hard. But I don't know that the amount of work is all there is in terms of inhibiting discussion. I think it's also the thought that, and I mean, this touches on things that both Spencer and Siddhu and Mariam all said, which is that MIT students are used to quantitative thinking, and they're used to solutions that are clear. And when you get into these complicated political, moral questions, the kinds of questions that free speech focuses on, those answers, the issues are much more nuanced. And I think students are genuinely concerned about hurting people's feelings, and they think that if they stick their head in the sand and don't think about them and just do their science, they won't have to engage with these questions. But then we come back to the problems that Mariam pointed out and that Spencer alluded to, that, you know, then things do explode on campus for various reasons. And you can think about the speaker at commencement last year and many other issues, some that came up earlier today. And so I guess my question to you guys would be, let's put concourse aside for the moment because it doesn't serve, you know, the whole student body. But what are some ways or norms that you think could be promoted either by you, by student organizations, by faculty, by the administration, that would help or that could make students feel more comfortable, kind of the way we do in Concourse. But, you know, part of that is it's a smaller community, we get to know each other, and, you know, that has its own benefits. But if there are ways that we can nurture the kind of conversation that Siddhu especially was talking about that would avoid the conflagration that winds up happening that, you know, Mariam referred to. I don't know if you guys have any ideas what kinds of things can be done. If you want to talk about a specific incident, how could something like that, what kind of norms, what kind of approaches could be undertaken to avoid those? And just whoever wants to say anything, jump
Can I add a bit to this question?
Pardon?
Can I add a bit to
Please,
this question?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I think another thing I'm curious of is that at least when I've been on like other campuses, including Berkeley and some of the Ivies, it's a bit of like a faux pas to say, oh, I want to do a quant job. I want to work in like some either like big finance or like role. But I feel like there's an element here, which I think is like of like people almost embrace like, yes, I'm gonna earn the salary that earns me the most money. And like I think that there's some amount of, you know, do people feel like that's like something that people like, is there a sense that this is a salient issue for most undergrads versus just like get a nice stable job, life will be good?
Okay. What do you guys, anybody have any thoughts?
I mean, I can go a little bit on like your point about students being sort of afraid of disagreeing or afraid of speaking their minds. And I mean, I don't have an answer to the institutional level, like what MIT can do specifically, but I mean, I can diagnose this a little bit from my perspective, and that's something, especially in the younger generations, we've been raised in a different way. I mean, you probably have heard the term helicoptering parenting. So, you know, a lot of parents would coddle their children. They would, you know, do whatever their children want, and instead of, you know, forcing them to maybe face adversity a little bit, maybe face some opposition a little bit, maybe, you know, do things that they don't like. And students or children and, you know, Gen Z, a lot of Gen Z individuals have been raised in this kind of environment. We have social media, these echo chambers where, you know, if I'm a right-wing person, I get all the right-wing information, I follow all these figures. So it's confirmation bias. If I go on you know, Twitter and, you know, left-wing person, I see all the things that would confirm my belief. And so this sort of excludes people from other ideas and sort of like predisposes them to, you know, just one, and to not disagreeing with other people, and I think that's a dangerous side. So I mean, like what I said earlier about the panacea to these problems coming from the community, coming from family, coming from some of the less institutional side. I think that's one of the things that we can do is to raise children better, but also
that's a little bit beyond though what we can do here.
That's true.
So maybe, but a good thought for any potential parents in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, just to your question, I think it's a good thing to point out that it's not necessarily the amount of work, but the type of work. So like in highly technical environments, you learn how to communicate in a technical manner. So it's a lot easier for a student to point out that like a data point is wrong, or there's sort of, they understand how to communicate technical disagreements because you're all working towards a shared common goal of like pushing innovation forward. And that's something that I think is incorporated into our education at MIT. No matter what lab class you're taking, you're doing some form of communication, presentation, scientific writing, and you learn like what you're supposed to do in those situations. So we don't come in with that knowledge, but we're sort of very well prepared to communicate our technical ideas to people and sort of the framework for handling disagreements. So I know you said not to mention concourse, but I think it's good that, when you have a debate, there are norms, there's a framework, there's a way to talk to the moderator and not, aggressively approach someone else. And there's ways to make sure that you're exploring both viewpoints. I think that in humanities classes, it should become a norm to sort of set the standard for how you communicate with your peers and frame it in the same idea that we're all working towards a shared goal.
I think that's a really important point. What is our shared goal at the university? This came up before, but I think that is something that could be set from top down. Did you want to add?
I think one thing that doesn't get emphasized enough just going through MIT is that when we leave, we're going to be leaders in all kinds of ways, and we're spoken of as being innovators and disruptors who are going to solve problems using our science. But that also means that we have big civic responsibilities, and we need to have good civic habits and practices. And so how do we think of problems that aren't subject to the scientific method? How are we going to use our technology and science? What does it mean for a technology to serve a human need? Those are important questions. And so I think less than like big rules around what speech is allowed and isn't, I think you need to think about what kind of speech we want to encourage, and that's less a question of rules and more a question of which practices we take up. And so I think like the civil discourse events are a great way. That's not just a small seminar. We have one tonight about
we do.
Should monogamous marriage be the social ideal? And so we'll have 2 speakers duke it out and have a bunch of students figure out what they think on the issue. I think requirements are a big thing. Like, do we allow students to fulfill their humanities, arts, and social science requirement by taking microeconomics and just taking a bunch of derivatives and drawing graphs? I mean, does that accomplish what we want them to accomplish through a humanities class? And I think in the humanities classes, professors need to take seriously the responsibility that part of the goal of the humanities is to help students cultivate judgment about personal and political questions, and that requires them to push back against what students say, to force them to defend their arguments and not just to nod along to what students say just because they happen to agree. So I think responsibility from everyone.
Great. Let me open this up to questions. Okay, let me take Ian.
Ian Hutchins, Professor Emeritus of Nuclear Science and Engineering. I've got a simple question. MIT is currently reconsidering what the General Institute requirements should be. Would you, panelists, recommend that a concourse-like experience, specifically with student debating, become part of the General Institute requirement for every student?
One thing I just want to say is I think that I'm maybe biased here I'm assuming I'm biased here against the others in a particular way, where I think there's we can either say that the problem is that people are not exposed to this, or we can say the problem is that people like have this option already to be exposed to this and routinely choose to like not. I've mentored a few Europs. All the Europs view they're on CS doing like AI research, highly technical. They all view their humanities and social sciences courses as like a problem to be optimized. Let me figure out the minimum amount of work I need to do to allow myself to have time for research.
That's why it would have to be required of all students, or they wouldn't do it otherwise.
But even then, if people don't want to learn how to have like a structured debate, these are very smart people. They can figure out exactly how to fulfill your requirements with the minimum investment in work possible. And I've seen this happen. I've TA'd some of these students, and I think it's just like, I think it's extremely hard to create buy-in if there is not some buy-in pre-existing.
I kind of, sorry. I think those are interesting points. I would offer my perspective is that I think yes. I think like that should be part of the requirements, not just to like better MIT campus culture, but it's doing students a service when they leave MIT to not look, incompetent when they're communicating with people and they have to like, push their idea forward in a way that's civil. I think that even if it's a GIR that people don't take as seriously, just being exposed to that and having some kind of positive peer pressure to participate in like a big debate, I think that it would be a really constructive step forward, even if it's not the ultimate solution. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I feel like students can learn by osmosis, even though they don't have the, intention of being in class, or they don't want to be in class. Just by being in class, they would sort of like absorb some of these ideas. But also, I would add on to the recommendation that we would set a high bar for students to pass these classes. So for example, like some of the classes, students may not have to participate much, but for these classes specifically, attendance should be absolutely mandatory, but also a clear, number or clear guideline on how students should contribute. Otherwise, student would just sit back and sort of just listen to the conversation, not contribute, not being proactive. So we should also set requirements for students to be proactive in the curriculum. And we can discuss more about the specifics later. But
Did you want to? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to say the idea of a requirement implies that students actually don't know very well what would be best for them. And so MIT then makes a decision that says, we want students that are like this, and then sets out requirements that then hopefully form students in that way. So I think it's really hard to scale something like Concourse, which is like a small seminars, political philosophy. Like you're not going to find many Professor Rabiehs out there of comparable quality. And so maybe
He's not in my class right now. It's not like a grade is depending on this. I just want you to know that.
But I think something like that, right? Like a kind of civic education at MIT, like have students read things from the American political tradition or about responsibility when it comes to building technologies. What have been good technologies of the past? How do we think about technologies that are good? I think something like that would be important for all students.
And if I can just add one quick point about this, which is, obviously we have many wonderful humanities professors at MIT, but there is a problem that I think many humanities professors in SHAS suffer at MIT a little bit from an inferiority complex, because that's not our main thing. And I wonder if that a little bit doesn't seep in sometimes to their own defense of the worth of their classes. I do think that it is really important for faculty to make what I often call the implausible boast, that this class that you're taking is a crucial class and maybe the most important class that you can take during your time at this university. And it's crazy, and you can joke about that, but in a way you need to believe that in order to make students, and they're not all going to care, by no means. Some of them are going to hate you for it because they're going to think it's annoying. But it's worth it to make that claim, and I just wonder sometimes whether that's a little bit harder for us at MIT than at other places. All right, yes, you had your hand up, and then you, and then you.
Michael Mounty, I'm a lecturer in writing, rhetoric, and professional communication. I wanted to build off of what one thing that Siddhu said about the responsibility of humanities instructors, and then also address something that Ani mentioned about immigration concerns. So in the spring semester, the Trump administration threatened to deport students who express support for Hamas. So is it part of humanities instructors' responsibility to protect students in classroom discussions by not letting them discuss Israel-Palestine?
Who's that a question for? Me or? Well, why don't
Wait,
you
so
guys go?
Just so I understand correctly, are you saying is it the role of an instructor to protect students by disallowing them from speaking about Israel-Palestine?
Yeah.
That's the question?
If you had a debate about it scheduled and canceled it because you didn't want your students to get deported?
So maybe let me just say one quick thing, which is I don't want to minimize those concerns that Ani raised. Those are definitely real concerns. Social media is a problem. We don't televise our debates. They're not on Zoom. They're not recorded. We ask students not to record them. We don't, you can certainly advise your students, maybe it's not prudent to post your ideas on social media, but I don't think it's ever right to say we shouldn't talk about something in a classroom. The whole idea is to create a space where you can talk about it and talk about it in a way that's productive. Okay, I don't know if you guys wanted to add to that, but I know we only have about another, 10 minutes? Sorry, there were a couple of other, did you guys want to add to that?
I was going to say, it's in the classroom, especially where those conversations can happen at their best.
Yeah.
Rather than the hallways. So.
Yeah.
I would also just say that I think that those are conversations that need to be had. I understand what you're saying, but I also think that maybe it should be up to students the amount of risk they're willing to take, and maybe the instructor's job isn't necessarily to stop conversations from happening, but make sure that they set norms in an environment where students feel safe to openly discuss their opinions.
Yeah, please.
Kevin, class of 86. So we learned earlier today that 34% of college students think it's okay to use violence to silence a speaker they disagree with. So my question is very simple. What's wrong with y'all?
I think I might be a good person just because of I did spend some time at Berkeley. I think that so I guess funny story here. My first exam I took in college was the day that Ben Shapiro spoke at Berkeley, and so there was like helicopters flying over during my exam day. This was like 2017, because relative to these people, I'm a geriatric. That being said, I do think that a lot of the times, if you look at the wording of these questions, like some part of it is phrasing, some part of it is like, but I think there is some element of like, I think that for people across generations, it is very easy to get like one shot by social media algorithms. I think that there's been a rise in any number of like relatively extreme views, and as someone who has done research on recommendation systems, both in terms of the optimization perspective and also some of the kind of it's very hard to make policy around this, but it's also I think true that if you take a lot of extreme beliefs and word it in a certain way, you can find relatively high support in polling. So some part of me wants to say, I think that like for that particular statistic from FIRE, I think it's partially due to, I don't think it's people who would act on that belief. But that being said, I think even when I was at Berkeley, and this was like on paper maybe a more common belief, in practice, this, relatively speaking, rarely happened. I think the worry is more, like, you want to have this, it's clear that this, okay, I don't think people act on these beliefs, but I think people adopt these beliefs due to social media, and adoption is already a problem because if I credibly believe the other person believes this, and they say they believe it, it doesn't matter if they don't act on it, I'll still change my behavior. But I do think that there's some distinction there.
Anyone else want to defend your generation?
Yeah, I guess I would, maybe I just don't know enough about this, but is that like a figure that's gone up in our generation? Yeah. Yeah, I mean.
Do you sense that on campus? Do you know people who feel this way? Or is that something people wouldn't admit to? Or are they comfortable admitting that they think this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's surprising because I don't think I know anyone who would openly admit that. I guess like with the Charlie Kirk incident, like that was very, very shocking for me and I think a lot of people, and like disgusting that you wouldn't, that you would use violence instead of words. So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe it is the algorithm thing.
I think maybe one way to make sense of it is that the stakes in our politics feel incredibly high, and so they're always high. That's what politics is. But I think especially students feel like, oh, everything is up for grabs right now, and so maybe anything is necessary. And I think there's also a lack of historical understanding about what it would mean to say that you no longer need to use speech to achieve your political goals or figure things out. And so I think there's that, and there's the overconfidence in one's own political knowledge.
One last piece I want to say, like, practically speaking, I think if you're at a protest, like, the people you are more scared of, regardless of kind of what political affiliation you're protesting like for and against, are the like, not the students, but the like slightly older people who like drove out to that protest because they are like much more selected for being the type to take like relatively strong actions for their views. This is like purely anecdotal, but like I do think there's an element of I do think our generation sometimes like can put up says things stronger than what they actually believe. But.
Interesting. You and then you. You'll go ahead. Yeah.
All right, here we go again. So anyway, thanks for setting the discussion. I guess back to the notion of why discussion does or doesn't happen on campus. And I think you pointed to the workload and maybe some of the inhibitions. But I guess the question is really, is that all there is, or has part of the culture become the pressure that only one point of view is accepted? And even to something like pro or against Israel or whatever, right? In the context of a classroom, perfectly fine. When you go out and plaster on social media or go out and occupy the entrance to the university, totally different story, right? Particularly if you're a foreigner. So the question is, to what extent do you see that lack of discussion based on, or as a result of maybe only one viewpoint being accepted between both the student body and maybe much of the faculty, particularly?
I mean, I totally agree that the predominance of certain ideology is a discouraging factor for a lot of people, to speak their mind. But also, it's not just the predominance, but also the willingness to, go to the lengths of censoring, to the length of calumny, to the length of, the polling data that was suggested earlier about the use of violence. I mean, that's an interesting point, by the way, and I'd attribute it, as I said earlier, to sort of like the upbringing of Gen Z, but also to the permission structure that's been in place in the last 20 years. So we've seen, like recently, in the last election, that a lot of narratives about, oh, Trump's gonna end democracy, or Trump's gonna, send us back to the making Handmaid's Tale, Gilead. You've heard that or read that book. Like a lot of narratives, a lot of things that are being put, but also from the right. Sometimes you get some of the more extremist viewpoint saying, oh, the left wants to socialize America, makes America become communist. And that's the kind of permission structure that gives rise to, like Siddhu suggested, that people believe that stakes are high, and we've seen historically that the youth are especially a passionate generation. We saw that during the Vietnam War, the Black Panthers, the racial movement in the 1960s. And I think it's because of these narratives that are being pushed on both sides. That students are more willing to resort to this kind of belief or this kind of violence. And I mean, like personally, I've not, seen like a lot of violence on MIT's campus specifically, but I mean, my take on it is that people are in fear of consequences. I mean, like if you can commit violence, you get repercussions, and I think that's what stops people from actually committing the violence. But in terms of the thought itself, 24% of Americans, like especially Gen Zs, actually believe that when somebody they disagree with dies or gets attacked, that's okay. That's cause for celebration. So it's just maybe a lack of action in that case, but thought still reigns.
Now that I think about it in terms of my friends who maybe wouldn't be, as much in thinking about speaking up, I think there's a sense of like just exhaustion with politics. It's too much to follow things and to like, it's like painful to think about these things. It's really hard to think about. And so I literally had friends tell me like, okay, just tell me like what's the right thing to think. And like, it's easier that way. And so I think there's like, especially for students who don't think of themselves as interested in these questions or like, they want to be able to do their science, like Professor Rabieh suggested, like there's just a deference and like a shrug given to maybe the most passionately ideological people. And so like, okay, sure, that makes sense to shut down that speaker or like not talk about that. But I think if you were able to somehow show them that these questions are interesting, which they are, and I think it's like even when you like talk to these people who don't think of themselves as interested in politics, and like they end up like lighting up and wanting to talk about these things, even at MIT.
Yeah,
and so I think
that's true. They forgot that it's fun to argue. That's, there's fun, they're too, and I think this goes back to things that they've all said and that we've heard before, that, everybody's so worried about being hurt and offended, and they forgot that, it's fun to be challenged, and it's fun to try to defend your opinion, especially when you're young. It gets harder when you're older and you have a lot at stake, then it is harder, but yeah.
One other thing
Yes,
I'll add.
go ahead
Sorry,
and-
you can skip.
Sorry.
No, you can go to the next
No,
question.
go ahead,
Oh,
and
sorry.
then we'll take the last
I guess like
question.
the quick thing I wanted to say is I think that I also think it's really important that we, like, in the spirit of free speech, we need to also allow like relatively extreme speech. I think it is like you should be allowed to call Joe Biden a socialist or Donald Trump a fascist, and like I think it's important to not try to like the reason we have a commitment to free speech, and is that we want to have a world where we are not just like at the level of generations before, but we don't have this phenomena where like, which we saw with like McCarthyism, Red Scare historically, of like, I don't think it should be an effective insult or something we should censor for to, critique people based on like some sort of label. That's obviously idealistic, but I think we need to also protect that speech.
Thank you for coming. You were not any less eloquent than a lot of distinguished professors who spoke earlier. There was a young lady here earlier who mentioned that there is a difference in generations. And so if you indulge this true geriatric, who is probably old enough to be your grandmother, to ask you politically incorrect question, and I'm only interested, honestly, in your personal opinion. And I know it's not your decision. I'm just asking for your opinion. Why do you think there is not a single white person on a panel?
I can take a gander at this.
just if you there's the probability distribution. If you randomly selected 4 people who are, it's probable that they.
Plenty of white people and students at MIT, right?
So actually, I'm going to give like a potentially incorrect opinion on this. I think actually there was this fun little thing where after affirmative action ended at like MIT, the proportion of like white students in the population went down. This is like not maybe the answer to your question you're looking for, but I do think it's like there's a good, most of the undergrad population I think is South or East Asian. I don't know if that's changed. I think that like the other bit of this is that like if you're selecting for people who are like more inclined politically, you're also probably selecting for, like you're selecting for other traits, and I think that might correlate. So I don't have a strong answer for you, but if I had to guess, like it's a combination of like MIT is like very Asian population-wise, combined with MIT is like also like some selection criteria factors that intersect.
Do you want to say something? Go
Oh,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, Siddhu and I mentioned that when we got up here, so thanks for the observation. I do think, I think it might have a little bit to do with investment in these issues and how directly they touch our lives. It's not to say that, I mean, Professor Rabieh is white, I think, and she's pretty invested in this. So it's not to say that like white people don't care about these things. It's just to say like maybe the level of like passion and involvement that we've had in these issues has had a bit more of a personal twinge, and like it's, you can identify a part of our identity by just looking at us, and that has sort of probably led to like how we approach these issues and why we've been involved in these things. Not to say that, white people don't also care. They do.
But if I can just add to that, one thing that I have noticed, this is an interesting question, is that sometimes people from backgrounds, from immigrant backgrounds, appreciate the American rights and freedoms and more than people who've been born here and who just accept them. So I never thought about that because I just asked students on the basis of students I thought would be good, and had something to say. But that's an interesting point, and I wonder if that isn't true.
I can second that. I believe the person you asked before me was white. So
Yes, although I had you in mind.
friend of mine, yeah, great.
I guess if there are no other questions, I was just looking at the QR code and the citation there. Speak freely, think critically. The Free Speech Balance Act. And I just think to conclude the panel, if there are no more questions, one thing I would say in my experience has made it much easier for students to have very controversial, difficult conversations with each other in a productive, enjoyable way, is that thinking critically, we usually think of that in terms of being critical of other people. We're always critical of them first. And one thing we stress a lot, I certainly stress this a lot, is you also have to think critically about yourself, your own opinions. And that's precisely why you want to subject them to as many different viewpoints and to the scrutiny of others. I think Jonathan mentioned this earlier too, that critical thinking in a way begins with being critical of yourself, and engaging in open discourse is one of the best ways to do that.
Quick question about Concourse.
Sure.
All of your discussions, class discussions, maybe debates, or do you actually require written papers?
Yes, there's a lot of writing too. Yeah, I mean, so there's different formats. So we have classes, there's small seminars, there are debates, there are roundtable discussions. In the classes, yes, there's writing, plenty of writing, lots of essays. Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you invite people to your event?
Oh, if anybody's interested in thinking about whether monogamous marriage should be the social ideal, this is one to bring in the students at the beginning of the year. It's tonight in Building 2, Room 190, so you're very welcome. There's a reception afterwards. You'll see the Civil Discourse Project with my colleagues Brad Scow and Alex Byrne, and Ann McCants will all be there. Oh, actually, Alex is sick, but the rest of us will be there tonight, so please join us. Thank you all very much for hosting us in this panel, for staying this late, and for your very thoughtful and interesting questions. So thanks very much.